3 years after my wife died, my family found me in a hospital lobby, and what happened in the next 5 minutes was not an accident. He stood there with his wife beside him, her voice soft and practiced. "We're worried about you. The doctors warned us, memory loss, confusion. It happens after grief. There's no shame in it." My daughter was already crying behind them, her hands shaking, believing every word. I looked at my son's wife. I looked at the way her eyes moved around the room, measuring, calculating, and I smiled. 5 minutes later, she finally understood what that smile meant. Before we go further, thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Tell me in the comments what city or country are you watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Note, some elements of this story are fictional added to serve the narrative and its message. Names and locations are coincidental, but the lesson at the heart of it is one I believe matters. My name is Arthur Miller. I am 64 years old, and the morning my daughter screamed at me in the middle of a hospital lobby was the morning I finally understood how completely my son and his wife had rewritten my life without ever asking my permission. It was a Tuesday in April. I had come to Massachusetts General Hospital to visit an old colleague, Raymond, who had just come through a knee replacement surgery. Nothing unusual, nothing planned. I had mentioned it to Peggy the afternoon before, just in passing the way neighbors talk across a fence about ordinary things. I did not know until much later that Victoria had called Peggy that same evening, asking casually how I had been spending my time lately. Peggy had no reason to suspect anything. She mentioned Raymond's surgery and my visit the next morning. That was all Victoria needed. I signed in at the front desk, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, spent 40 minutes with Raymond talking about the Red Sox and bad hospital coffee, and then rode back down to the main lobby. That was when I heard her voice. "Dad." I turned. Lily was standing 20 feet away, her face flushed red, her eyes swollen from what looked like hours of crying. She was wearing a cream-colored coat I had given her for her birthday 2 years ago. Her hands were shaking at her sides, like she was trying to hold herself together and failing at it. Behind her, Charles stood with his arms slightly open, wearing the expression of a man performing concern for an audience. Victoria was one step to his right, her posture perfect, her face arranged into something that looked almost like grief but wasn't. I took one step toward Lily, and her entire body stiffened. "Don't!" Her voice cracked on the single word. "Don't you dare walk toward me like everything is fine." A nurse at the reception desk looked up. An orderly pushing a cart slowed down. 3 people waiting near the coffee machine turned their heads. "Lily," I said quietly, "let's find somewhere to sit down and talk." "Talk." She let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, her hand flying up to cover her mouth before the tears spilled over. "You want to talk after everything you've done, after what Charles showed me. Lily, sweetheart. Boinem seasons, yak do. Don't call me that." Her voice broke wide open, and the tears came down her face in a single hard rush. Her shoulders heaved. Her knees actually buckled slightly before she steadied herself against a nearby pillar. "You were stealing from Mom's trust. You were going to leave us with nothing. Charles has the records. He showed me the wire transfers." The lobby had gone very quiet. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room pressing against the side of my face. An elderly man near the exit had stopped pretending to read his magazine. A doctor in scrubs had paused mid-stride. Victoria stepped forward, then her voice dropping into the gentle, worried register of a woman who had clearly practiced this. "Arthur," she said, resting a hand briefly on Lily's shaking shoulder, "we all know you've been under enormous stress. The doctors warned us that sometimes after a significant loss, behavioral changes can look like, well, it's nothing to be ashamed of. Early cognitive decline can affect anyone." She said it quietly enough that only the people within 15 feet could hear. But 15 feet in a hospital lobby is a very large radius. I looked at Victoria. I looked at the way her eyes moved around the room as she spoke, cataloging reactions, measuring impact, doing exactly what a crisis communications expert does when she wants a narrative to take root before anyone can question it. And then I did something that confused her. I smiled. Not a polite smile. Not an embarrassed smile. The smile of a man who had spent 3 weeks reading every document inside a folder called Project ETF and knew exactly how this scene had been scripted and exactly how it was going to end. Victoria's left hand tightened around the strap of her clutch bag, just for a second, just long enough for me to notice. Lily pressed her fist against her mouth and kept crying, her whole chest shaking with it. Charles put his arm around her and murmured something into her hair, and I watched him do it with the particular ache of a father who knows his child is being held by exactly the wrong person. I looked at my watch. 6 days until the 3rd anniversary of Eleanor's death. 6 days until everything my son and his wife had built came apart at the seams, not because I had planned a dramatic confrontation, but because Eleanor had been smarter than all of us. She had always been smarter than all of us. I did not go straight back up to see Raymond after that. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for a long time, both hands wrapped around the steering wheel, staring at the concrete wall in front of me without seeing it. Around me, the garage did what parking garages do. Tires squealed on the level above. An elevator dinged, a car alarm chirped twice and went quiet. None of it reached me. My hands looked old to me at that moment, the knuckles thicker than they used to be, the skin looser, more papery at the joints. I kept thinking about another pair of hands smaller than mine, steadier than mine in the years when my own hands shook from exhaustion, and overwork always reaching for mine in the dark when either of us woke at 3 in the morning and the house was too quiet. Eleanor's hands. She had been diagnosed in March of 2021, ovarian cancer stage 3. I had driven her to the appointment at Massachusetts General because she had asked me to, which told me she already knew Eleanor only asked for company when she expected news she did not want to receive alone. The oncologist, a precise and careful woman named Dr. Hartwell, had used phrases like aggressive treatment protocol and realistic expectations, and I had sat in that office next to Eleanor and held her hand so tightly that she had squeezed back and whispered, "Arthur, you are cutting off my circulation." Even then, even in that office with those words hanging in the air between us, she had made me laugh. That was Eleanor. 36 years of marriage, and she could still find the exact thing to say that opened a door in the middle of a sealed room. Eleanor Margaret Miller had grown up in a 3-room apartment in Dorchester, with a mother who cleaned offices downtown and a father who had left before Eleanor was old enough to remember his face. She had put herself through Boston University on scholarships and waitressing shifts, had built her first real estate portfolio before she turned 30. And by the time I met her at a mutual friend's dinner party in 1985, she already owned 2 rental properties and had opinions about zoning law that she was not shy about sharing. I had thought when I first heard her talk that evening that she was the most focused person I had ever met in my life. I was right. I just did not yet understand what that focus looked like when it was pointed at a problem she was afraid of. She was an only child. Her mother had passed in 2008. Her father had never reappeared. Arthur and their children were all the family she had, which was why in the end she trusted the law more than she trusted people. People Eleanor had learned early could be exhausted or distracted or desperate. Documents held regardless. It was a Tuesday evening in February of 2021. 4 weeks before the diagnosis was confirmed, when she brought out the yellow legal pad. We were sitting at the kitchen table in the Back Bay house, the same table where we had eaten 30 years of ordinary dinners, and she had the pad in front of her, covered in her small, precise handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who had been keeping careful notes her entire adult life because she understood that memory was fallible, but paper was not. "I want to set something up for Lily," she said. Her voice was matter of fact, the voice she used when she had already thought something through completely and was presenting a conclusion rather than opening a discussion. "Something Charles cannot touch. Eleanor, I am not being dramatic." She set her pen down and looked at me with those clear gray eyes that had never once in 36 years let me get away with anything. "Charles is in trouble financially, Arthur. He thinks I do not know, but I know. I can see it in the way he talks about his deals, in the way Victoria has been very careful not to mention certain things when we are all together. And if something happens to me, he will come after whatever I leave behind, not out of cruelty, out of desperation, which is almost worse." My chest ached at the calmness in her voice, the kind of calm that is not peace but the thing you build around fear so that it cannot spread. My throat tightened until I had to look away at the kitchen window, just to keep myself from falling apart in front of her. "Nothing is going to happen to you," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped along the edges. Eleanor reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her grip was firm and warm and completely steady. "Promise me something instead of arguing with me," she said. "Can you do that?" I turned my hand over and held hers properly. "Tell me what you need." She had already called Daniel Reeves. Daniel was a trust and estates attorney with an office on Boylston Street, whom Eleanor had worked with for years on her real estate holdings. He was a quiet, methodical man in his early 50s who wore the same style of wire-rimmed glasses he had probably worn since law school, and who never once in my experience raised his voice above the register of a man reading something important out loud. Eleanor trusted him the way she trusted anyone who showed up prepared and did not waste her time. Eleanor had Daniel Reeves draft an irrevocable trust under Massachusetts general laws, Chapter 203E, the Massachusetts Uniform Trust Code. An irrevocable trust. Daniel explained to me in his careful way, at our first meeting in his Boylston Street office, cannot be dissolved or altered after it is signed. Not by the grantor, not by the beneficiary, not by anyone. Once Eleanor signed, the document became a permanent structure, the legal equivalent of a load-bearing wall that no one could remove without bringing everything else down with it. $15 million, accumulated over 30 years of Eleanor's careful, relentless, methodical work. The rental properties, the commercial holdings, the years of 7 o'clock mornings and contracts reviewed at the kitchen table after dinner. Placed permanently beyond reach except under 2 specific conditions. Lily could access the funds upon a lawful marriage. Or I could sign a formal declaration, a trustee certification of financial emergency, confirming that the family faced a genuine financial crisis of a severity that required intervention from the trust. 2 doors, both narrow, both requiring either time or my direct judgment to open. Why those 2 conditions? I had asked Daniel during that first meeting. It was Eleanor who answered from the chair beside me without looking up from the document she was reading. Because Lily needs to be standing on her own 2 feet before she handles that kind of money, she said. And because I trust Arthur's judgment about what constitutes a real emergency. She paused long enough to turn a page. I do not trust everyone else's. Sophie Callahan, Eleanor's personal assistant of 6 years, witnessed the signing in Daniel's conference room on a Thursday afternoon in April. Sophie was 26 then, small, precise, with reddish hair, and the slightly formal manner of someone who had spent years learning to be useful to a demanding professional and had absorbed her methods along the way. She stood at the side of the conference table with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression composed and serious. Someone took a photograph that afternoon. I do not remember who, but the photograph exists because Sophie sent it to me 3 years later in a February email with no subject line and no message, just the image attached. Eleanor seated at Daniel's conference table, the trust agreement open in front of her, pen in hand. Her face turned very slightly toward the camera, and on her face the particular expression I had watched her wear all my life, when she had solved a problem that had been troubling her, settled completely at peace. The expression of a woman who has built something she trusts to hold. She made me promise to protect Lily before she died. In this same hospital 4 weeks after the diagnosis, with the spring light coming through the window of her room, and her hand in mine, and her grip weaker than it had ever been. I had promised. What neither of us had known sitting in that conference room, while Sophie straightened the pages and Daniel uncapped his pen, was how soon I would need to keep it, or what keeping it was going to cost. 2 years after Eleanor died, the house on Marlborough Street still smelled like her. Not her perfume exactly. She had stopped wearing perfume during the treatments. More like the particular combination of old books, strong coffee, and the cedar sachets she tucked into every closet, because she had read somewhere that cedar kept moths away, and she had never stopped doing it once she started. I had not changed anything about the house in 2 years. I told myself it was because I was still settling her estate. The truth was simpler and harder than that. It was a Thursday evening in April when Charles came. He did not call ahead. He never called ahead. When he wanted something he had learned as a boy, that a phone call gave the other person time to prepare a refusal, and Charles had always preferred to catch people off guard. I heard his car in the driveway, recognized the sound of it, and felt something tighten in my chest before I even opened the door. He looked terrible. I had seen Charles look tired, before I had seen him look stressed, had seen him after late nights and bad deals. But the man standing on my front step that April evening looked like he had not slept properly in weeks. His suit jacket was wrinkled at the elbows. There were shadows under his eyes so deep they looked bruised. His jaw was tight, and his hands, I noticed, were gripping the strap of his shoulder bag hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Dad." His voice was rough. "Can I come in?" I stepped back and let him through. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Eleanor had laid out her yellow legal pad 2 years before, and told me she did not trust everyone's judgment. Charles wrapped both hands around the mug of coffee I poured him and stared into it for a long moment before he spoke. "I'm in trouble," he said. "Real trouble. The Kellerman deal collapsed. Ryan and I were both in deep on that commercial property fund, and when the market shifted, he stopped, pressed his lips together. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something he could not swallow. "We're looking at $2.3 million, Dad. Between the mortgage on the Beacon Hill house and the investment losses and the credit lines, we are $2.3 million underwater." The number landed in the room like something physical. I set my own mug down carefully. "How long have you known?" I asked. 8 months. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were red at the corners, not from crying, I thought, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who had been lying awake staring at the ceiling every night for most of a year. I kept thinking I could fix it. I kept thinking the market would turn, or Ryan would find a buyer, or something would... He exhaled hard, a sharp, frustrated sound. "It hasn't turned. Nothing has come through. Victoria and I have been holding it together with credit cards for 6 months, Dad. 6 months. I looked at my son across the kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with his homework 30 years ago, where he had sat and told me proudly about his first real estate deal at 26, and I felt something that was equal parts grief and clarity. "What are you asking me, Charles?" He reached into his shoulder bag and pulled out a folded document. He placed it on the table between us and slid it toward me with 2 fingers, the way you slide something across a table when you are not entirely sure it will be welcomed. "It's called a trustee certification of financial emergency," he said. "It's a legal declaration under the trust agreement Mom set up. If you sign it, if you certify in writing that the family is facing a genuine financial crisis, it triggers an early release of Lily's trust funds. We wouldn't be taking her money permanently. We would use it to clear the debt, stabilize the Beacon Hill house, and pay it back once things recover." I did not touch the document. I looked at it for a long moment at my son's handwriting in the margin where he had tabbed the signature line with a yellow sticky note that said simply, "Sign here, Dad." "If I sign," I said, "where does the money go first?" Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes moved to the document, then to his coffee mug, then to a point somewhere over my left shoulder. That half-second of hesitation told me everything Eleanor had already known 2 years ago at this same table. I stood up. My knees felt stiff the way they always did in damp April weather, but my voice was steady when I spoke. "The money your mother left is Lily's future," I said. "I made Eleanor a promise the week before she died. I am not going to break it because your investment went badly, Charles. I am sorry you are in this position. I genuinely am. But I will not sign that document." Charles's face crumpled for just a moment, a raw, desperate expression that made him look briefly like the boy he had been rather than the man he had become. Then it hardened again. He picked up the document, folded it, and put it back in his bag. He stood up without finishing his coffee. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to make." After he left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched his taillights disappear down Marlborough Street. A minute later, a knock came at the back door. It was Peggy Hollis from next door, holding a foil-covered plate and wearing the expression of a woman who had very good hearing and a long memory. "Was that Charles?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She looked at me for a moment with those sharp blue eyes that had watched this neighborhood for 40 years. Then she held out the plate. "Apple cake," she said firmly, "and I'll put the kettle on." Victoria called on a Wednesday morning in June, 2 months after Charles had walked out of my kitchen, with his unsigned document and his quiet threat. I should say something about Victoria, because Charles alone would never have been capable of what came next. Charles was desperate and greedy, but desperation and greed without discipline are just noise. Victoria was something else entirely. She had spent 15 years as a crisis communications consultant, the kind of person corporations called at 2 in the morning when a scandal was about to break. The kind of person who could look at a disaster and see with cold clarity exactly which lever to pull to make it disappear. She did not panic. She did not improvise. She planned. "Arthur?" Her voice on the phone was warm, concerned, exactly calibrated. "I've been thinking about you so much lately. Charles and I both have. You've been carrying so much since Eleanor passed, and we haven't done enough to support you." My grip on the phone tightened slightly. "I'm fine, Victoria." "Of course you are," she said in the tone of someone who believed the opposite completely. "But there's a wonderful specialist I'd love for you to meet. His name is Jonathan Vance. He works with people who've experienced significant loss. He helped a close friend of mine through something very similar. And I really think just one conversation, Arthur, just to have someone to talk to." I said I would think about it. I went because I was lonely. That is the truth I did not want to admit for a long time afterward. 36 years of marriage leaves a silence in a house that no amount of work or routine can fill, and I had been walking around inside that silence for 2 years without telling anyone how heavy it had become. Jonathan Vance's office was on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone in Cambridge, just off Massachusetts Avenue. The waiting room had 2 armchairs, a small table with a water pitcher on it, and a bookshelf lined with titles about grief and resilience. Jonathan himself was a man of about 45 medium height, with a calm, unhurried manner and a blue cardigan that looked like it had been chosen specifically to make people feel comfortable. He shook my hand firmly and asked me to sit down. "Tell me about Eleanor," he said, and I did. For 50 minutes, I talked about my wife, about the way she laughed, about the yellow legal pad she always kept on the kitchen table, about the cedar sachets in every closet, about the morning she died, with the spring light coming through the window. Jonathan listened without interrupting, leaning slightly forward, his expression open and attentive. When I left that first session, my chest felt fractionally lighter than it had in months. I told myself this was what healing felt like. I was wrong about that, but I did not know it yet. What I did not know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that Jonathan Vance's license as a licensed mental health counselor had been revoked by the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Allied Mental Health in 2019. A licensed mental health counselor, or LMHC, is required by Massachusetts law to maintain active registration with the board before practicing any form of counseling or psychotherapy. Jonathan's registration had been pulled 4 years before I ever sat down in his armchair. The office itself had been leased through a limited liability company registered in Victoria's name, 18 months paid in full in advance. That same evening, Victoria sent Jonathan an email. I would not read it until much later, on a night in Vermont when everything became clear. It said, "First session complete. He trusts you. Begin phase 1 vocabulary next week." 2 days after my appointment, Peggy Hollis stopped me outside while I was checking the mail. She had a slightly puzzled expression on her face, the look of a woman turning something over in her mind. "Arthur," she said, "that man who went into your house last Tuesday, the one in the blue cardigan. I saw him coming out of Charles and Victoria's place about 2 weeks ago. I thought it was strange at the time." She paused, frowning. "It's probably nothing." "Probably," I said, but I filed it away. A good architect never throws away a measurement just because he does not yet understand where it fits. By the 6th session with Jonathan Vance, something had shifted inside me that I could not name and could not reverse. It had happened gradually, the way erosion happens, not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow, patient removal of small things, 1 grain at a time, until the ground beneath you is no longer what it was. Jonathan never accused me of anything. He never raised his voice or made a direct claim. He simply asked questions in that calm, unhurried way of his, and then waited while I answered, and then asked another question that sent me back to re-examine the first answer I had just given. "Have you noticed yourself forgetting things more often lately, Arthur?" "I don't think so," I said. "Take your time," he said. "There's no wrong answer." And the terrible thing, the thing I am still ashamed of when I think about it, is that I took his time. I sat there in that armchair, and I actually searched my memory for evidence that I was losing it, because he had asked me to, because he had framed the question so gently that refusing to consider it felt like denial rather than confidence. Victoria was doing her part at home. It started small. My car keys would disappear from the hook by the back door, where I had hung them every single day for 11 years. I would search for 20 minutes, my heart beating faster than it should, my mind doing the thing Jonathan had primed it to do, cataloging, questioning, doubting. Then I would find them on the kitchen counter, and Victoria would say with a soft, worried smile, "You put them there yourself this morning, Arthur. Don't you remember?" My blood pressure medication moved from the bathroom cabinet to the bedroom dresser. My reading glasses appeared in the garage. A folder of financial documents I needed for a meeting with my accountant vanished for 3 days and reappeared in a kitchen drawer I never used. Each time Victoria's explanation was the same, gentle, concerned, completely reasonable. Each time I felt the ground shift slightly beneath my feet. The morning I could not find Eleanor's drawing was the worst. It was a pencil sketch I had done in 1987, the first architectural drawing I had ever made for her, a rough plan for the house we had dreamed of building together before we had the money for it. Eleanor had kept it in a flat wooden frame on the bookshelf in the study for 30 years. One morning in September, I went to look at it and the shelf was empty. I tore the house apart. I searched every room, every drawer, every box in the basement, my hands moving faster and faster, my breath coming shorter, a cold panic spreading up from my stomach into my chest. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself there was an explanation. But Jonathan's voice was in my head. Have you noticed yourself forgetting things? And for 3 days I could not silence it. I found the drawing on the 4th day wrapped in a cloth and placed inside a cardboard box in the garage. I had no memory of putting it there. None. That night I called my sister Claire in Providence. It was past 11 o'clock. She picked up on the second ring. Arthur, her voice sharpened immediately with alarm. What's wrong? I need you to tell me something honestly, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped raw at the edges. Do you think I'm becoming unstable? There was a sharp intake of breath on her end. Why would you ask me that? Just answer me, Claire, please. Arthur Miller, she said, and her voice was fierce and immediate. You are the most clear-headed person I have ever known in my life. Whatever is making you ask that question, it is not coming from inside you. Do you hear me? My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and breathed through my nose until the feeling passed. Come up, I said finally. Please. Claire drove from Providence the next morning. She spent 2 days at the Marlborough Street house, and in those 2 days she watched Victoria carefully, the way Victoria moved through rooms that were not hers, the way she answered questions I had not asked, the way her eyes tracked everything and everyone with a precision that had nothing to do with affection. Something is very wrong in this house, Claire told me quietly on her second evening, standing in the back garden where we could not be overheard. Her face was tight with worry she was working hard to contain. I don't know exactly what it is yet, but I want you to promise me you'll call Dr. Owens tomorrow. Dr. Patricia Owens had been my physician for 12 years. She was a no-nonsense internist at a practice on Commonwealth Avenue who had the useful habit of saying exactly what she meant. I saw her 2 days later, and she ran every test she had available, cognitive assessments, neurological screening, blood work. Arthur, she said afterward, folding her hands on her desk and looking at me with the directness I had always valued in her. There is nothing wrong with your mind. Your cognition is completely intact. Wherever this concern is coming from, it is not coming from your medical history. I should have felt relieved. Instead, sitting in her office with those clean results in front of me, I felt something colder and more clarifying, the first real edge of understanding that what was happening to me was not accidental. I want to tell you about Lily at 8 years old. She used to climb onto the stool beside my drafting table on Saturday mornings and watch me work. She would sit there for an hour without fidgeting, her chin propped in both hands, her dark eyes moving across the blueprints with an attention that surprised me in a child that age. One morning, she pointed at a foundation plan and asked, "Why do you always draw the bottom part first, Dad?" "Because everything that lasts starts with something nobody sees," I told her. She thought about that for a moment, her small face very serious. Then she looked up at me and said, "Like love." I had laughed and pulled her into a hug that made her squeal in protest. "Exactly like love," I said. That was the Lily I was thinking about on the morning the court letter arrived. It came from Suffolk County Probate and Family Court on a Tuesday in late November. The envelope was standard, official, unremarkable. I opened it at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me and read it 3 times before the words fully assembled themselves into meaning. A petition for guardianship had been filed. The petitioner was Charles Edward Miller. The respondent, the person to be placed under guardianship, the person deemed potentially incapable of managing his own affairs, was listed as Arthur James Miller. My daughter had signed the supporting declaration. Her signature was at the bottom of page 3 in the round, careful handwriting she had used since middle school. I set the letter down on the table. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that specifically I checked, and they were completely steady, because I needed to know whether I was going to fall apart, or whether I was going to think. I chose to think. What I pieced together later from Lily herself and from others who had been watching was this. 3 weeks before that letter arrived, Victoria had gone to Lily's apartment in the South End on a Sunday afternoon. She had brought coffee and pastries from a bakery on Tremont Street, and she had sat across from Lily at her small kitchen table with an expression of painful reluctance on her face, the expression of a woman about to say something she desperately wished she did not have to say. She had shown Lily a document, a printed page of what appeared to be bank transfer records, showing a series of large wire transfers from an account in Arthur Miller's name to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The transfers totaled $340,000. They were entirely fabricated, but Lily did not know that. "I didn't want to show you this," Victoria had said, her voice careful and low, and full of performed anguish. "Charles and I have been going back and forth about it for weeks. But you have a right to know what's happening to your mother's money, Lily. You deserve the truth." Lily's eyes had filled with tears before Victoria even finished the sentence. Her hands had started shaking around her coffee cup, and she had pressed them flat against the table, trying to steady them, and the tears had spilled over anyway, running down her face while she stared at those fabricated numbers and felt the ground open up beneath her. Then Charles had transferred $72,500 into Lily's personal account. He had called her that same evening, his voice gentle and regretful, and told her it was money Eleanor had set aside privately just for Lily, separate from the main trust that Arthur had been quietly withholding. "Mom wanted you to have this," Charles had said. "I found the documentation. Dad was keeping it from you, Lily. I don't know why, but you needed to know." Lily had sobbed on the phone for 20 minutes. She had believed every word. 2 days later, Charles had placed the petition for guardianship in front of her and explained it was simply a protective measure, a way to ensure that Arthur's affairs were properly managed while he was struggling. "We're not punishing Dad," Charles had said. "We're protecting him, and we're protecting Mom's legacy." Lily had signed it with tears still drying on her face. "I did not know any of this when the letter arrived. I only knew the result, and the result was that my daughter, the child who had once told me that love was the foundation nobody could see, had placed her name on a document describing me as incapacitated. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Margaret Cole, and she ran a small elder law practice on Newbury Street that a colleague had recommended 3 months earlier, back when I had first begun to understand that what Victoria was building around me was not concern. It was a cage. Margaret Cole had short gray hair, and the kind of direct, unhurried intelligence that reminded me of Eleanor. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she set her pen down and folded her hands. "Arthur," she said, "the court has appointed a guardian ad litem, an independent attorney whose job is to represent your interests before any guardianship ruling is made. That person has not yet made a recommendation. That means there is still time." She paused. "But we need to move carefully. Any contact with Lily right now could be characterized as harassment or undue influence in the guardianship file. I know that is painful, but you need to let me handle the communication for now." I nodded. My jaw was tight enough to ache. "Can we stop this?" I asked. Margaret looked at me steadily. "If the evidence supports your position," she said, "yes, we can stop it completely." I drove home from her office through the November dark, the city lights smearing in the rain on my windshield, thinking about a little girl on a drafting stool asking why you always draw the foundation first. December came and went, and the pressure did not ease. It increased. Jonathan submitted a preliminary psychological assessment to the probate court in the second week of December. 14 pages of careful clinical-sounding language describing a man with observable disruptions in short-term memory consolidation, episodes of heightened emotional dysregulation, and diminished capacity for complex financial reasoning. Every phrase had been constructed to sound like medicine while meaning something closer to theater. Charles hired an attorney named Gerald Foss, a probate specialist out of a firm on State Street, who had filed guardianship petitions before and knew exactly how to move them efficiently through the Suffolk County court system. Margaret Cole called me after reviewing Foss's initial filings, and her voice, normally steady and composed, had a tightness in it that told me she was genuinely concerned. "Gerald Foss is good at this," she said. "He's filed 43 guardianship petitions in the last 6 years and won 38 of them. The guardian ad litem the court appointed is a woman named Patricia Strand. She's experienced and fair, and I've already reached out to her. But, Arthur, I need to be honest with you. If Jonathan's psychological assessment goes unchallenged and Charles's legal team keeps this timeline moving, we could be looking at a preliminary ruling within 60 days. What happens if they get the preliminary ruling? I asked. You lose the right to sign any legal documents for 60 days minimum, Margaret said, including anything related to Eleanor's trust. I sat with that for a moment, feeling the walls of the thing they had built around me pressing inward. Peggy came to the door 2 days before Christmas with a tin of shortbread cookies, and the particular expression she wore when she had made a decision about something. Arthur, she said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited the way she had done for 20 years. Charles was here again last week while you were at Margaret's office. He was in the house for almost 2 hours. She set the cookie tin down on the kitchen counter and turned to face me, her blue eyes sharp and direct. I don't know what he was doing in there, but I watched him carry 3 boxes to his car when he left. I wrote down the time and the date. I thought you should know. My chest tightened. The drawing, the documents, the keys, all of it suddenly arranged itself into a colder, clearer shape. Thank you, Peggy, I said, and I meant it in a way that went well beyond cookies. Margaret called me on a Thursday morning in early January and laid it out plainly. The guardian ad litem has reviewed Jonathan's assessment. She has questions about his methodology, which is good for us, but she also needs time to conduct her own evaluation. And while that process is underway, the court is going to be hesitant to rule in your favor. Arthur, I want you to consider something. Tell me, I said. Leave Boston for a while. Not because you're running, because a good legal strategy sometimes requires removing yourself from the immediate theater of conflict so the opposition overextends. She paused. You have somewhere you can go? I thought of Woodstock, Vermont. The cabin Eleanor and I had rented every October for 20 years. The same owner, the same wood stove, the same view of the mountains going copper and gold. After Eleanor died, I had bought it outright because I could not imagine another family sitting in those rooms. Yes, I said, I have somewhere. I drove to the Marlborough Street house one last time in the second week of January to collect what I needed. I moved through the rooms, slowly touching things I was not ready to leave: the kitchen table, the bookshelf in the study, the cedar smell of Eleanor's closet. I packed 2 bags. Then I went to the study to retrieve the wooden box of Eleanor's personal papers that I kept on the bottom shelf. That was when I saw the gap in the sofa cushions. The leather sofa along the study wall had a deep gap between the seat cushion and the back cushion, the kind of gap that swallowed television remotes and reading glasses on a regular basis. Something was wedged in there, a corner of black plastic barely visible. I reached in and pulled out a tablet computer, an iPad older model, the screen dark. I turned it over. On the back, in black marker and Charles's handwriting, was a single letter, C. I pressed the home button. The screen lit up without asking for a password. The Face ID function had been disabled, probably to save battery life, on a device that was rarely used anymore. The iCloud account had been actively syncing. The home screen was full of app icons, and in the upper left corner, a folder. The folder was labeled Project ETF. My thumb hovered over it for a long moment. The study was very quiet around me. Outside, a car moved slowly down Marlborough Street through the January cold. I pressed the folder open. Before I tell you what was inside that folder, and I promise you nothing could have prepared me for it, drop the number 8 in the comments so I know you're still with me. Just a note, some details in this story have been shaped for narrative purposes and may not reflect every factual circumstance, if that's not your kind of content. This is a natural place to step away. No judgment at all. I drove back to Vermont that same night. I did not pack properly. I took the wooden box of Eleanor's papers, the iPad, my coat from the hook by the back door, and the half-full thermos of coffee I had made that morning before driving down to the house. I did not turn off the kitchen light. I did not lock the back door. I drove north out of Boston on the interstate with the January dark pressing against the windows on both sides and the heater running too loud and the iPad sitting on the passenger seat in Eleanor's wooden box like something I was transporting under controlled conditions, which I suppose was exactly what I was doing. I arrived at the cabin at 11:30. The temperature had dropped into the single digits and the snow on the path from the driveway to the front door had hardened into a crust that cracked under my boots with a sound like something breaking. I got the wood stove going, filled a glass of water. At the sink, sat down at the table and placed the iPad in front of me. I had not opened the folder again since the study. I had not wanted to read what was inside it while I was still in that house in those rooms, surrounded by the smell of cedar and the particular quality of silence that a house develops when everyone who loved it is either gone or changed beyond recognition. I wanted to read it here, in Eleanor's cabin, in the place where we had been most purely ourselves. I pressed the home button. The screen lit up. The folder was still there on the home screen, exactly where it had been 3 hours ago. Project ETF. I pressed it open. There were 9 files inside. I opened the first one. It was a document called Session Tracking Master. 11 pages each one, dated, each one divided into 2 columns. The left column was headed Vocabulary Deployment. The right column was headed Observe Response. I read the first entry and understood immediately what I was looking at, and the understanding arrived not as a shock, but as a slow, cold confirmation of something I had been half suspecting for months, without allowing myself to name it directly. Session 3. Vocabulary Deployment, Memory Inconsistency, Emotional Volatility. Observed response subject became reflective, asked follow-up questions about grief-related cognitive changes. Advanced to Phase 2, Language Next Session. The subject. That was me. That was the word they had used for me in their field notes, not Arthur, not Dad, not even Miller. Subject. The clinical distance of it was not accidental. You called a person a subject when you needed to stop thinking of them as a person. Session 6. Vocabulary Deployment, Diminished Executive Function Difficulty with Sequential Reasoning. Observed response subject, accepted framing without resistance. C is now using confusion unprompted in description of the subject's recent behavior. A milestone has been reached. I read that entry twice, then I read it a third time. Victoria referred to her husband throughout these documents only as C, the same single letter written on the back of the iPad in black marker. One character. Deliberate. The habit of a woman who had spent 15 years in crisis communications and understood instinctively that the smallest footprint was always the safest one. What stopped my breath was not the initial, it was the word milestone. A milestone has been reached, as though my son, standing in a therapist's office and using a word that had been deliberately planted in his vocabulary to describe his father's supposed deterioration, was an achievement worth celebrating. As though the erosion of a marriage and the systematic dismantling of a man's trust in his own mind were project benchmarks to be checked off a list. I set the iPad down on the table and pressed both palms flat against my thighs. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way Dr. Owens had taught me years ago for managing blood pressure spikes during stressful situations. In, out, in, out. The wood stove ticked as it heated up. Outside, the Vermont night was completely still. Then, I picked the iPad back up and kept reading. Session 11. Victoria has provided updated framing material. C now reliably uses the phrase married to her patients to describe subject's professional orientation. Recommend transitioning language from distracted to emotionally unavailable in next 3 sessions. The shift needs to feel like C's own conclusion. I knew that phrase, married to her patients. I had heard it from Charles in my kitchen, from the study where I had sat with him after Eleanor's diagnosis from a Sunday afternoon, when he had used those exact words to describe how I had always prioritized my career over my family. I had thought at the time that it was his genuine feeling. I had sat with the guilt of it for months. It was a phrase that had been written on a planning document and handed to a man in a blue cardigan to deploy in session 11. I moved to the second file. It was a spreadsheet. Clean, precise, the kind of document Victoria would have prepared every column, labeled every figure, formatted consistently, no wasted space. 12 rows. Each row had a date, a transfer amount, and a memo field. The dates ran from June of 2023 through November of 2023. The amounts varied slightly, $8,000 here, $12,000 there. One larger payment of $22,000 in September. The total in the summary cell at the bottom of the amount column was $120,000. The memo field on every single row read the same strategic consulting fee, J. Vance, $120,000. I sat with that number for a moment. That was what they had budgeted for the project of convincing me I was losing my mind. That was the line item in the spreadsheet of my dismantling, Not a rounding error, not a minor expense, $120,000 transferred in 12 careful installments across 6 months to a man whose license to practice any form of mental health counseling had been revoked 4 years before he ever shook my hand and asked me to tell him about Eleanor. My chest felt like something had been placed on it, not pain exactly, pressure. The specific physical sensation of a weight being lowered onto you, slowly enough that your body adjusts to each increment and only registers the full accumulation when you finally try to breathe deeply. I opened the third file. It was an email thread. The participants were listed as V and C, Victoria and Charles. The thread ran from March of 2023 through November. I scrolled to the most recent message dated the 14th of November, 4 days before the petition for guardianship was filed with Suffolk County Probate Court. Victoria had written, "See, Lily is fully committed. She signed this morning. The GAL appointment is a minor complication, but Foss says we can work around Patricia Strand's timeline. Once the old man signs under duress or the court declares him incompetent, the certification goes to Daniel and the funds are released within 30 days. He'll rot in a nursing home in the suburbs and never understand what happened. This is almost done." Charles had replied with 2 words, "Finally, thank God." I read it twice. My jaw tightened until I could feel the pressure all the way into the back teeth. My hands had curled into fists against my thighs at some point without my noticing, and I made myself open them deliberately finger by finger and lay them flat against my legs. He'll rot in a nursing home in the suburbs and never understand what happened. That was the ending my son had been working toward. Not some abstract harm, not a legal maneuver with unintended consequences. A specific considered outcome, his father in a facility somewhere, on the outskirts of a city he had lived in for 40 years, stripped of the legal capacity to manage his own affairs, separated from everything Eleanor had built. And this was the part that landed like a physical thing, never understanding what had happened to him. The cruelty of that last clause was not incidental. Victoria had written it deliberately. She had wanted Charles to read it and feel not discomfort, but relief. The old man will never understand. That was supposed to be a comfort. I breathed through it, in, out. The wood stove was doing its job now, and the cabin had warmed enough that I had taken off my coat without noticing. I opened the 4th file. It was a single page. At the top, in Victoria's precise header, formatting the same formatting she used for every document she had ever prepared, because Victoria was a person for whom presentation was a form of control, was a title, Lily allocation rationale, and tracking. Below, it was a paragraph. Transferred $72,500 to Lily Miller, personal account, on November 9th. Source Charles' personal line of credit. Framing Eleanor's private bequest withheld by Arthur. Lily accepted framing completely. Emotional state highly distressed, fully receptive. Note for record, once Lily executes the guardianship declaration, she finally has real value to this process. Prior to that, she was a liability. I read the last 2 sentences again. Once Lily executes the guardianship declaration, she finally has real value to this process. Prior to that, she was a liability. I put the iPad face down on the table. The January dark outside the cabin windows was complete and absolute. No streetlights out here, no passing cars, just the darkness of a Vermont night in winter pressing against the glass. The wood stove ticked. My water glass sat untouched beside the iPad. She finally has real value. My daughter, 24 years old. The child who had sat on a stool beside my drafting table at 8 years old, and asked why you always drew the foundation first, and then said, like love, when I explained it. The child who had inherited Eleanor's habit of pressing too hard with her pencil, because she wanted everything she wrote to last. That child had been assessed by her brother and his wife, and found to have no value to their process until the moment they could extract something useful from her grief. Prior to that, she was a liability. I looked at my watch. It was 12:43 in the morning. I had been sitting at this table for 11 minutes since putting the iPad down. I know it was 11 minutes because I had looked at the watch when I put it down, and I was looking at it now. 11 minutes on the floor of my own understanding in the wreckage of what I had believed about my family, with the smell of wood smoke and cold air around me, and Eleanor's wooden box on the chair beside me, and the knowledge of what had been done sitting inside my chest, like something that had been swallowed the wrong way and would not go down and would not come back up. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. Not because crying would have been weakness, but because what I felt in those 11 minutes existed at a depth that tears could not reach. Tears are for grief. What I felt was older and colder and more absolute than grief. It was the particular clarity that arrives when you have been half afraid to know something for a very long time, and the thing you were afraid of knowing has finally stepped fully into the light and shown you its actual shape, and the shape of it is exactly as bad as you feared, and the fear is gone now because there is nothing left to be afraid of knowing. I stood up. My knees ached from the cold and from sitting too long on a hard chair. I picked up the iPad, carried it to the shelf beside the wood stove, and set it carefully on top of Eleanor's wooden box where I could see it. Then I went back to the table. I opened my laptop. I created a new document and typed the date and the time at the top of the first page, 12:54 in the morning, January, Vermont. Below that, I typed 3 words: what I know. Then I began to write. I wrote for 2 hours. I wrote everything: the dates, the amounts, the file names, the specific phrases from the session, tracking document, the email thread, the Lily allocation paragraph. I wrote it in the order. It had happened from June of 2023, when Jonathan Vance had first shaken my hand in that Cambridge office through every session, every moved key, every rearranged medication, every planted word that had taken root in my son's vocabulary and grown there until it felt like his own thought. I wrote it the way I had always written project documentation, factually, completely, without editorializing, because facts did not need editorializing when they were this specific and this well documented. When I finished, I had 4 pages of single-space notes and a clarity of purpose that I had not felt since before Eleanor died. I saved the document. I titled it the same thing I had titled the first one, What I Know, and I added the date. Then I closed the laptop and sat at the table in the Vermont cabin, with the wood stove doing its work and the dark outside the windows beginning very slightly, almost imperceptibly, to thin at the edges toward morning. I was 64 years old. I was a retired architect with arthritic knees in a cabin in Vermont, and a family that had tried to take everything Eleanor had spent her life building and had very nearly succeeded. Very nearly. I reached across the table and turned the iPad right side up. The screen had gone dark. I pressed the home button and watched it light up again, and I looked at that folder. Project ETF9 files the entire architecture of what had been done to me, laid out in the precise and self-incriminating language of people who had been confident they would never be found. And I felt something that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite satisfaction, but was closer to all 3 of those things than it was to anything else. A good architect, when he discovers that a structure has been built incorrectly, does not panic. He does not demolish blindly. He reads the existing conditions, carefully identifies every load-bearing element, and designs a controlled intervention that removes what is dangerous without bringing down what can still be saved. I had the existing conditions in front of me. Now I needed a plan. I have spent 40 years as an architect. In that time, I have learned that the most dangerous moment in any construction project is not when something goes wrong. It is the moment just after you discover something has gone wrong, when the temptation to act immediately to tear out the bad work before you fully understand its extent is at its most powerful and its most destructive. I did not act immediately. I drove to Woodstock the morning after I found the iPad, and I spent 3 days in the cabin doing nothing but reading, organizing, and thinking. I read every file in the Project ETF folder twice. I made a handwritten index of every document, every email, every transfer record with dates and amounts and the names of everyone mentioned. Then I put the iPad in the wooden box that had held Eleanor's personal papers, placed the box on the highest shelf in the cabin bedroom, and called Margaret Cole. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause of about 4 seconds, the pause of a person rapidly reorganizing their understanding of a situation. "Arthur," she said, "do not touch that iPad again until I tell you to. I'm going to arrange for a digital forensics specialist to create an authenticated copy of the device's contents. Under Massachusetts rules of evidence, we need to establish what's called a chain of custody, a documented, unbroken record of how the evidence was collected, stored, and handled. If we do this correctly, everything on that device becomes admissible. If we do it carelessly, a good defense attorney can challenge the entire record." "How long will that take?" I asked. "A week, maybe 10 days. In the meantime, I need you to write down exactly how you found it, The date, the time, what you were doing in the house, precisely where the iPad was located, and the condition it was in when you picked it up. Every detail. Do it today while it's fresh. I did it that afternoon. 4 pages handwritten, dated and signed. The forensic specialist Margaret sent was a quiet, methodical man named David Crane, who drove up from Boston on a Thursday with a hard-sided case full of equipment and spent 2 hours in my cabin creating what he called a forensic image of the device. An exact verified digital copy of every file, every email, every piece of metadata preserved in a format that courts recognized as reliable. He handed me a signed certification document when he left and told me the original iPad should now be stored somewhere secure and untouched. I put it back in Eleanor's wooden box. The second call I made was to Owen Barrett. Owen ran a small investigative firm out of an office on Tremont Street in Boston. He was 55, former law enforcement, with the careful, unhurried manner of a man who had learned long ago that patience produced better results than urgency. A colleague of Margaret's had used him twice in elder financial abuse cases and described him as thorough to the point of being relentless. Owen's first task was Jonathan Vance. Within 5 days, he had confirmed what the iPad records suggested. Jonathan's licensed mental health counselor registration had been revoked by the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Allied Mental Health in March of 2019. The cited reason was a boundary violation with a former client. Since that date, Jonathan had not held any valid license to practice counseling or psychotherapy in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Every session he had conducted in that Cambridge office had been illegal under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 112, Section 263. There's more, Owen told me over the phone, his voice even and unhurried. The LLC that leased the Cambridge office space Vantage Consulting Group is registered to a Victoria Ann Miller Beacon Hill address. Lease term 18 months, paid in full at signing. The payment cleared in May of 2023, 2 weeks before your first appointment with Vance. My hand tightened around the phone. Is there anything else on Victoria? Owen was quiet for a moment. She was named as a defendant in a civil lawsuit in New York County in 2018. Defamation and tortious interference. A former client claimed she had deliberately spread false information to damage his professional reputation during a contract dispute. The case was settled confidentially in 2019. No admission of liability, but the settlement amount was substantial enough that the plaintiff's attorney described it publicly as appropriate. I absorbed that. Victoria had done something like this before. Not to a family member, but the instinct, the methodology, the willingness to use information as a weapon against a specific person's credibility, she had done it before. The third piece came from Sophie Callahan. Sophie had worked as Eleanor's personal assistant for 6 years, managing her real estate portfolio. Her correspondence, her calendar, and the administrative details of her business until Eleanor became too ill to work. She was 29 now, working at a property management firm in Cambridge, and she had seen the guardianship petition notice in the Suffolk County Public Court. Records Massachusetts law required guardianship petitions to be listed in public filings, and she had called Margaret Cole's office the same afternoon. Margaret brought her to the cabin on a Saturday in late February. Sophie was a small, serious young woman with reddish hair and the slightly formal manner of someone who had spent years managing a demanding professional's affairs and learned to be precise about everything. She sat across from me at the cabin table and placed a document wallet in front of her that she did not immediately open. Mrs. Eleanor told me something the day she signed the trust agreement, Sophie said. Her voice was steady, but her hands pressed flat against the table, the knuckles pale with the effort of keeping them still. She said I wrote it down afterward because I wanted to remember it exactly. She said, Sophie, if Charles ever tries to access this fund before the conditions are met, I need you to call Arthur immediately. Not a lawyer first. Arthur first. Sophie looked up at me, and her eyes were bright with something that was close to tears, but had not quite arrived there. I should have called you sooner. When I saw the court filing, I felt sick, Mr. Miller. I am so sorry it took me this long. Her hands were trembling slightly now against the table despite her efforts. I reached across and covered them briefly with mine. You called, I said. That's what matters. She opened the document wallet and slid a folder across to me. Inside was the original trust agreement, Eleanor's signature at the bottom of the final page, Sophie's witness signature beside it, Daniel Reeves's notary seal in the corner, And on page 7, in the precise legal language, Daniel had drafted a clause that made the entire project ETF not just immoral, but catastrophically irreversibly self-defeating. Any attempt to access trust funds through fraudulent documentation, false certification, or legal manipulation shall result in the permanent exclusion of the responsible party from all trust benefits, and shall trigger mandatory reporting to the Massachusetts Attorney General's office under Chapter 19A of the Massachusetts General Laws. Eleanor had not just protected the money, she had built a trap into the foundation of the thing they were trying to steal. I sat back in my chair and felt for the first time since November something that was close to steady ground beneath my feet. I found Jonathan Vance through Owen Barrett, who had been keeping a loose watch on his movements since February. Jonathan was no longer in Cambridge. The office on Massachusetts Avenue had been quietly vacated in January. The LLC that held the lease had simply stopped paying and let the landlord reclaim the space. Jonathan had moved back to a studio apartment in Somerville, working part-time at a landscaping company owned by a friend, and by all appearances he was a man who had recently had something go badly wrong in his life and was trying to figure out what came next. Owen told me something else. Charles and Victoria had stopped returning Jonathan's calls in December. The final $38,000 of the agreed $120,000, the last payment promised upon delivery of the completed psychological assessment to the court, had never arrived. Jonathan had sent 3 emails and left 2 voicemails. All of them had gone unanswered. They had used him and then simply stopped picking up the phone. I asked Owen to pass a message to Jonathan, not through a lawyer, not through any formal channel, just a simple text from a number Jonathan would not recognize. The message said, "I'd like to talk about Eleanor. No lawyers, just a conversation. There's a coffee shop on Highland Avenue in Somerville called Forge, Tuesday at 10. Jonathan showed up 7 minutes early. I was already there when he walked in, seated at a corner table with 2 coffees and a plain manila envelope on the table in front of me. Jonathan looked worse than I remembered from our sessions. He had lost weight. The blue cardigan was gone, replaced by a canvas work jacket with a small tear at the left elbow. His eyes, when they found me across the room, did something complicated, a flash of guilt, then wariness, then something that looked almost like relief, which surprised me. He sat down across from me, without shaking my hand. He wrapped both palms around the coffee cup. I slid toward him and looked at the manila envelope without touching it. "You know," he said. His voice was rough, quieter than I remembered it. "I know," I said. He exhaled a long, ragged breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, the breath of a man who had been holding something in for a very long time. His hands tightened around the cup until his knuckles went pale. "How much?" he asked. "Everything," and I said. "The session tracking documents, the payment records, the emails." I paused. "Including the one where Victoria described you as a disposable tool they could distance themselves from when the work was done." Jonathan's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. He stared at the surface of the coffee for a long moment, and I could see the thing moving across his face, the anger, the humiliation, the particular burning shame of a man who had told himself the compromises he was making were temporary, and had just been shown in precise documentary detail exactly what the person paying him had thought of him all along. "They still owe me $38,000, he said. His voice had gone flat and hard. "I know that too," I said. I could have walked away. He looked up at me then, and his eyes were red at the corners, not from crying, but from the particular exhaustion of someone who had not been sleeping. After the 6th session, I knew by then what I was actually doing. I told myself it was already too late to stop, that you and your son were going to separate anyway, that I was just accelerating something inevitable. His voice cracked slightly on the last 2 words. That was a lie I told myself. I knew it was a lie when I was telling it. "I know," I said for the 3rd time. He looked at me with an expression I had not expected, raw and direct, and stripped of the professional composure he had worn through every one of our sessions. "Aren't you angry?" he asked. "You should be furious with me." I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was that I had been furious in the cabin in Vermont on a January night with an iPad in my hands and Eleanor's wooden box beside my knee. I had burned through the fury in those 11 minutes on the study floor and come out the other side into something colder and more useful. "I'm past angry," I said. "What I need now is the truth on paper." I pushed the manila envelope across the table. Jonathan opened it. Inside was the document Margaret Cole had prepared, an affidavit of material facts, 4 pages drafted under Massachusetts law. An affidavit is a written statement of facts made voluntarily under oath and signed before a notary public. Once signed and notarized, it carries the weight of sworn testimony. If Jonathan signed it and its contents were later found to be false, he would face criminal liability for perjury. If its contents were true, which they were, it became one of the most powerful single documents I could bring into any courtroom in the state. The affidavit stated in precise and numbered paragraphs that Jonathan Vance had conducted 31 counseling sessions with Arthur James Miller between June 2023 and December 2023, that at the time of those sessions, Jonathan held no valid license to practice mental health counseling in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, his LMHC registration having been revoked in March 2019, that the sessions had been arranged and funded by Victoria Ann Miller, that the purpose of the sessions as communicated to Jonathan by Victoria was to generate a psychological profile supporting a guardianship petition not to provide therapeutic benefit to Arthur Miller, that the preliminary psychological assessment submitted to Suffolk County Probate Court in December 2023 was not an independent clinical evaluation, but a document prepared according to specifications provided by Victoria Miller. Jonathan read it slowly. His coffee went cold while he read. When he reached the last page, he sat very still for a moment, both hands flat on the table, staring at his own name in the signature line. "If I sign this," he said quietly, "what happens to me? That's between you and your attorney," I said. "What I can tell you is that cooperating with an investigation is viewed very differently by prosecutors than obstruction is. And what I can also tell you is that Victoria and Charles are going to need someone to blame when this comes apart. You are the easiest person in this story to blame." I met his eyes. "Unless your version of events is already on record first." Jonathan picked up the pen I had placed beside the envelope. His hand was shaking a fine, visible tremor that he did not try to hide. He signed his name at the bottom of the 4th page. We walked 2 blocks to a UPS store on Holland Avenue where a notary public was on duty. Jonathan's signature was witnessed, stamped, and certified at 11:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in March. Outside on the sidewalk afterward, Jonathan stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the gray March sky above the Somerville rooftops. "I told myself I was just a consultant," he said, "that what I was doing was not really therapy, so the license didn't matter." He laughed a short, humorless sound. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever told myself." He walked away down Highland Avenue without looking back, his shoulders slightly hunched against the cold. I watched him go and thought of Eleanor. She had always said that people only betrayed when they believed there was no other way out. Give them a way out, and sometimes they surprised you. Dr. Patricia Owens had already provided her own documentation 2 weeks earlier, a comprehensive medical summary, confirming that Arthur James Miller showed no clinical indicators of cognitive decline, memory impairment, or diminished capacity for legal decision-making. Her report was 4 pages signed and had been submitted directly to guardian ad litem Patricia Strand. The ground was no longer shifting beneath me. It had set. Claire drove up from Providence on a Saturday morning, the last weekend of March, when the snow in Woodstock had finally thinned enough to show patches of dark earth underneath. She arrived at the cabin just after 11, carrying a paper bag of groceries she had bought at a store in town bread soup, apples a bar of the dark chocolate she had always brought to every difficult conversation we had ever had going back to childhood. She set the bag on the kitchen counter without saying anything, took off her coat, and sat down across from me at the table. Her face told me she had not slept well. There were lines around her eyes that had not been there at Christmas, and her hands, when she folded them on the table, had a slight tremor she was working to conceal. "I have to tell you some things," she said, "things I should have told you a long time ago. And I need you to let me get through all of them before you say anything, because if I stop, I don't think I'll start again." "Go ahead," I said. She told me 4 things. The first was small but cold. At Eleanor's funeral in the parking lot of the church in Newton, Victoria had pulled Claire aside while the other mourners were still filing out. She had taken Claire's hand in both of hers with an expression of deep practiced sympathy and said very quietly, "Claire, did Eleanor ever mention to you whether she had set anything aside specifically for Charles? In the estate, I mean. We just want to make sure nothing gets overlooked." Claire had pulled her hand back and told Victoria it was not an appropriate question for a funeral parking lot. Victoria had smiled, softly apologized, and walked away. I thought about it on the drive home, Claire said, her jaw tightening. I told myself she was just anxious about money. I told myself people say strange things when they're grieving. She pressed her lips together. I should have called you that night. The second thing was harder. In the summer of 2023, Claire had attended a dinner party at a colleague's home in Boston. Victoria had been there with a man she introduced as an old friend from graduate school, a man named Jonathan. Claire had spoken with him briefly. He had been vague about what he did professionally, changing the subject twice when she pressed. She had noticed the way his eyes went to Victoria across the room every time he answered a question, the fractional hesitation before each response, the look of a person checking to make sure they were saying the right thing. I've taught college students for 34 years, Claire said, her voice tight and controlled. I know what it looks like when someone is protecting another person's story. I knew something was wrong, and I did not call you. Her voice broke on the last four words, cracking open in a way she clearly had not intended. She pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth and breathed through her nose until she had herself back. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was overreacting. The third thing was a phone call. In the fall of 2022, Charles had called Claire and asked in a casual, offhand way whether Arthur had ever mentioned anything about updating his own will. Just curious, he had said. Just making sure everything was in order. Claire had told him she did not know and ended the call feeling vaguely unsettled without being able to say exactly why. She told me the fourth thing last. She looked at me directly when she said it, the way she had always looked at me when she needed me to understand something she found very difficult. Arthur, I was afraid. If I called you and I was wrong, I would have made trouble for nothing. And if I called you and I was right, she stopped. Her eyes filled, and this time she let the tears come, two of them tracking down her face while her chin trembled. If I was right, Charles would have found out I'd spoken to you, and I would have lost whatever was left of this family. I chose to protect myself instead of protecting you, and I am ashamed of that in a way I don't have words for. The cabin was quiet around us. Outside, a robin was doing something noisy in the bare maple tree beside the porch, the first one I had heard that year. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. Her fingers gripped back hard the way they had when we were children, and she was frightened of something in the dark. You're here now, I said. That's what matters. She shook her head. Fresh tears spilled over. It's not enough. It's enough for today, I said. And today is what we have. She stayed through Sunday. Before she left, standing at the cabin door with her coat on and her car keys in her hand, she turned back and asked, Are you going to be okay? Arthur, really? I looked past her at the yard where the snow had pulled back far enough to show a thin line of green pushing up along the fence line, early and stubborn and entirely indifferent to the cold that had been trying to stop it. I think I already am, I said. I want to tell you about what was happening to Lily during those same weeks, because she has told me since in pieces across several phone calls and one long afternoon in May, and I think you need to understand it before the rest of this story makes complete sense. Lily had been living in her South End apartment since November, with her phone contacts scrubbed of my number, my email address filtered into a folder she had been told not to open, and a carefully constructed version of reality that Charles and Victoria had been maintaining with the attentiveness of people who understood exactly how fragile it was. The first crack appeared in early February at a flower shop on Newbury Street. Lily had gone in to buy tulips. She always bought tulips in February, a habit she had picked up from Eleanor, who believed that flowers in winter were a form of argument against despair. She was standing at the counter when she heard someone say her name. It was Peggy Hollis, holding a bunch of white carnations and wearing the expression of a woman who had something on her mind and had just been handed an unexpected opportunity to say it. Lily. Peggy's voice was warm but direct, the voice of a woman who had watched this family for 20 years and was done pretending she had not. I'm glad I ran into you. I want you to know something, and I need you to hear it from me directly. She paused, her blue eyes steady and serious. Your father is a good man. I have lived next door to him for 20 years. I have watched him with your mother, and with you, and with Charles, and I am telling you whatever you have been told about him. It does not match the man I know. Lily's throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She gripped the stems of the tulips so hard the paper crinkled. You don't know everything that's happened, Peggy. No, Peggy said simply, "But I know him, and that counts for something." She paid for her carnations, gave Lily one long, careful look, and walked out. Lily stood at the counter for a full minute after Peggy left her chest aching with something she could not name and could not dismiss. The second crack came from an unexpected direction. Lily had a friend from college named Brianna Walsh, who was in her second year of law school at Northeastern. They had coffee in late February, and Lily, without meaning to, had started talking about the guardianship petition. Not the details, just the general shape of it. Brianna had listened and then asked a question that stopped Lily cold. "Is your father actually diagnosed with anything?" Brianna asked. "Like, clinically? Because in Massachusetts you need documented medical evidence of incapacity before a court will even consider a guardianship petition. A psychologist's report alone usually isn't enough if the subject has a treating physician who says otherwise." Lily had gone home and sat on her couch for a long time, turning that over in her mind. Arthur had a regular doctor, a real one. Had anyone asked her? Had Charles mentioned what Dr. Owens had said? She realized she did not know. She realized Charles had never brought it up. The third crack was the video. Victoria had sent it to Lily in early March, a short clip shot on a phone showing Arthur standing outside the Marlborough Street house, looking, Victoria had said in her accompanying text, disoriented and confused. "Watch how he keeps touching the door handle," Victoria had written. "This is what we've been dealing with, Lily. This is why we need guardianship." Lily watched the video 4 times. On the 4th viewing, something snagged in her memory like a thread caught on a nail. The clip showed Arthur standing in front of the Marlborough Street house on what looked like a winter afternoon. Bare trees, gray sky, his breath showing in the cold air. But in the lower left corner of the frame, just barely visible, was the bumper of a car parked at the curb. A dark green Subaru with a specific dent in the rear quarter panel that Lily recognized immediately because it was Charles's car. Charles's car. The car that Charles had been driving since the previous spring. Charles had told Lily specifically precisely in a phone call she remembered clearly because she had been sitting on her bathroom floor crying when he called that Arthur had moved to Vermont in the second week of January and had not been back to Boston since. The video was dated February 14th. Lily sat on her couch with the phone in her hand and felt the floor of the careful reality Charles and Victoria had built for her to develop a crack she could not ignore. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She opened her contacts, scrolled to blocked. Her father's name was there, grayed out sitting behind the barrier she had put up in November when Charles had told her it was the only way to protect herself. Her thumb hovered over it for a long time. She did not unblock it, not yet. The fear of being wrong was still stronger than the fear of being right. But she took a screenshot of the video. She noted the date in the corner of the frame, and she put the phone face down on the cushion beside her and sat there with her heart still hammering and the tulips she had bought on Newbury Street slowly opening in a glass of water on the kitchen counter across the room. The night before Eleanor's 3rd anniversary, I sat at the cabin table until past midnight and built 4 folders. Not metaphorically, literally 4 physical manila folders, each one labeled in my handwriting, on the tab, each one containing a specific set of documents arranged in the order I wanted them to be read. I had learned 40 years ago that the difference between a presentation that changes minds and one that doesn't is almost never the quality of the information. It is the sequence. People need to be walked through a structure before they can understand it. You do not hand someone a completed building and expect them to intuit the engineering. You show them the foundation first, then the frame, then the walls, then the roof. Folder 1 contained the project ETF emails, Victoria's communications with Jonathan, the session tracking document, the scheduling of Lily's manipulation. Folder 2 held the financial records, the $120,000 payment to Jonathan, the $72,500 transfer to Lily the bank. Records Owen Barrett had obtained showing the true extent of Charles and Victoria's debt. Folder 3 was Jonathan's affidavit, 4 pages notarized, devastating in its precision. Folder 4 was the evidence concerning Lily. The fabricated bank transfer screenshots Owen had traced to a document creation service. Victoria had used the text messages. Victoria had sent Lily the video with the date discrepancy and Charles's car in the corner of the frame. Margaret Cole called at 9 in the evening. Her voice had the focused quality it always had when she was running through a checklist. Patricia Strand filed her guardian ad litem report this afternoon. She said, she is recommending against the guardianship petition. Her report cites Dr. Owens' medical evaluation, inconsistencies in Jonathan's assessment methodology, and what she describes as insufficient independent evidence of incapacity. She paused. Arthur, the petition is effectively dead. Even without tomorrow, Charles and Victoria have already lost this in court. I pressed the phone against my ear and breathed for a moment. But tomorrow still needs to happen, I said. Yes, Margaret said. Because the fraud doesn't disappear just because the petition failed. Daniel Reeves needs to see the evidence in person. He has mandatory reporting obligations under Chapter 19A that are triggered the moment he reviews documented elder financial abuse. Once he makes that report to the Attorney General's office, the investigation moves beyond anything Charles and Victoria can negotiate their way out of. After I hung up, Owen called at 11. His voice was quieter than usual, with an undertone of something that sounded almost like satisfaction. Ryan Kellerman reached out this afternoon, he said. He wants to come tomorrow. He says he has been carrying this for 2 years, and he is done carrying it. He will confirm the full extent of the debt and his knowledge of Charles's financial situation going back to 2021. I thanked Owen and set the phone down on the table. The cabin was very quiet around me. Outside, the Vermont night pressed against the windows. No wind, no traffic, just the occasional sound of something moving in the tree line at the edge of the property. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. The 4 folders sat in a neat row on the table in front of me, their tabs facing up, their contents ordered and complete. I picked up the photograph of Eleanor from the shelf above the wood stove, the one Sophie Callahan had sent me. Eleanor at Daniel's conference table, pen in hand, smiling with her whole face the way she smiled when she had solved something that had been troubling her. I set it on the table in front of me and looked at it for a long time. I found the iPad, I told her. My voice came out rough and quiet in the empty cabin. I found Jonathan. I found Sophie. Claire came up last week and told me everything she should have told me 2 years ago. I stopped, cleared my throat. Lily is starting to see it. I don't know if she'll be ready tomorrow, but I think she might be. Outside, something rustled in the maple tree beside the porch, a branch shifting or a bird settling in for the night. I kept my promise, I said. Whatever happens tomorrow, Eleanor, I kept my promise. I sat with her photograph for another hour before I finally put it back on. The shelf turned off the lamp and went to bed. I did not sleep well. My mind kept running through sequences, the order of the folders, the positions of the people in the room, the particular way Daniel Reeves read documents slowly and from left to right, the way a man reads things he intends to act on. I kept thinking about the Commonwealth Avenue house, the study where I had found the iPad, the dining room where Eleanor had hosted 30 years of family dinners, the front hallway where she had hung a frame print of a Frank Lloyd Wright drawing that she had loved since college. I thought about the last time I had stood in that hallway and what I had felt. At 4:30 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely, made coffee, and sat at the table watching the Vermont dark begin to soften through the east window. By 5:15, the sky had gone from black to a deep bruise blue. By 5:45, there was enough light to see the tree line. I loaded the 4 folders into my briefcase set, Eleanor's photograph back in its place on the shelf, and carried my coffee cup to the sink. 40 years of architecture. I said to the empty kitchen, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Eleanor, or perhaps to myself. Every line has to be right. Every measurement is exact. I rinsed the cup. I put on my coat. I drove south toward Boston as the sun came up over the Connecticut River Valley, turning the bare hills gold on both sides of the interstate, and I did not look back. Before I walk you into that room, before I tell you what happened, when every person in this story finally sat down at the same table, drop ready in the comments. Because what comes next is the moment I had been building toward for 18 months. A reminder, some elements of this story are fictional woven in to serve its larger purpose. If you've stayed this far, I believe you're here for the right reasons, and I'm grateful for it. The house on Commonwealth Avenue looked exactly as it always had from the outside. Red brick 4 stories, black iron railings along the front steps. The 2 potted juniper trees Eleanor had placed on either side of the entrance 20 years ago, and that I had kept alive through 3 Boston winters since she was gone. The afternoon light was doing what April light does in New England, coming in at a low angle that made everything look briefly more significant than it was, gilding the brick and the bare branches of the street trees, in a way that felt almost like an apology for the winter just past. I parked on the street and sat in the car for 2 minutes, not from hesitation, just to let the building settle into me the way it always did, 30 years of living inside those walls, 30 years of Eleanor in every room. Then I picked up my briefcase, got out of the car, and walked up the front steps. Charles and Victoria had arrived first. Of course they had. When I came through the front door, they were already in the dining room, Charles standing near the window in a dark suit that fit him better than the last one I had seen him in, which told me Victoria had taken him shopping recently, probably to project the right image for the signing. Victoria was at the head of the table, her posture perfect, a leather portfolio open in front of her, and a pen placed precisely beside it. She had dressed carefully, a charcoal blazer, pearl earrings, the particular put-together presentation of a woman who understood that appearance was its own form of argument. Daniel Reeves was already seated at the far end of the table, his wire-rimmed glasses on a neat stack of documents in front of him. He looked up when I came in and gave me a careful nod, the nod of a professional man who was here to execute a legal process and intended to do so regardless of the personal dimensions swirling around it. Victoria looked up from her portfolio. Her expression was smooth and composed and welcoming in the way that a surface can be smooth and composed while concealing significant structural stress underneath. "Arthur," she said warmly, "I'm glad you came. I know today is difficult. It's difficult for all of us." She gestured toward the chair across from Daniel. "Why don't you sit down? We can get through this together, for Eleanor." The words "for Eleanor" landed in the room and sat there, and I thought about all the things those two words had been used to justify over the past 18 months, and I did not sit down. Lily arrived 7 minutes later. She came through the front door alone, without Charles, without Victoria's car, in a gray coat, with her hair down and her face showing the particular exhaustion of someone who had not been sleeping well for weeks. She stepped into the dining room doorway and stopped when she saw me. Her eyes went wide for just a moment, a flash of something raw and complicated that she pulled back quickly behind a careful expression. She did not go to Charles. She crossed to the far side of the room and sat down in a chair near the window, away from everyone, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving between me and the table and the front door, with the restless focus of someone waiting to understand something they had almost figured out. Charles watched her cross the room, and something moved across his face, a flicker of uncertainty quickly suppressed. Peggy Hollis arrived next, led in by me personally at the front door. She stepped into the dining room, took in the scene with one long sweep of her sharp blue eyes, and settled herself into the chair in the corner near the bookshelf that I had told her was hers. Charles looked at her and frowned. "What is Peggy doing here?" He asked me, his voice carrying the careful evenness of a man trying not to show that this development bothered him. "I invited her," I said. Charles opened his mouth. Victoria put her hand briefly on his arm, a touch so light it was almost invisible, but its meaning was unmistakable. Not now. He closed his mouth. The clock on the mantel read 3:52. At 3:58 I heard the front door open. I had left it unlocked for this purpose. Claire came in first, her coat still on her chin, up in the way she carried herself, when she had decided to do something that frightened her, and was not going to let the fear show. Behind her came Sophie Callahan, the document wallet under her arm, her expression composed and serious. And behind Sophie, moving with the careful, slightly stiff gait of a man who was doing something that cost him something, came Jonathan Vance. He was wearing a collared shirt and a jacket that looked like he had pressed it recently and carefully. His hands were at his sides. He did not look at Victoria when he entered the room, but Victoria looked at him. I was watching her when it happened, watching her face the way you watch a structure when you want to understand how it will respond to an unexpected load. For one unguarded moment, every layer of professional composure she had spent 15 years building simply dropped away. Her face went white, her lips parted, her right hand resting on the leather portfolio curled inward until her knuckles pressed hard against the cover. She understood immediately. She understood everything in the space of 2 seconds before a single folder had been opened or a single word had been said. Charles followed her gaze to Jonathan, and then looked back at his wife, and the color drained from his face too, but more slowly, the way a man loses color when he is watching something he built carefully, and over a long period of time begin to come apart. What is he doing here? Victoria's voice was very controlled, almost perfectly controlled. Almost. Jonathan looked at the floor. He did not answer her. He found a chair along the wall and sat down in it and folded his hands in his lap and stared at a fixed point on the opposite wall with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is holding on to it with everything he has. I set my briefcase on the table, clicked it open, lifted out 4 manila folders, each one labeled, each one ordered exactly as I had arranged them the night before in the Vermont cabin, while the wood stove cooled and Eleanor's photograph watched from the shelf. I placed one folder in front of Lily, one in front of Claire, one in front of Daniel Reeves. Then I looked at Charles and Victoria and placed the last one in the center of the table between them. Nobody moved. Daniel Reeves looked at the folder in front of him, the way he looked at every document he had ever been handed in 30 years of practice, with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who understood that what was written on paper had consequences that outlasted the room it was read in. He opened it from the left side, smoothed the first page flat with 2 fingers, and began to read. Charles looked at his folder without touching it. Victoria looked at hers without looking at it. Her eyes were tracking the room, moving from Daniel to me, to Jonathan, to Claire, with the rapid involuntary assessment of someone trying to calculate exits from a building that has just lost its structural integrity. I had placed one additional copy in the center of the table for Charles and Victoria to share. Neither of them reached for it. The first section, I said, is a document called Session Tracking Master. It was created by Victoria Miller and shared with Jonathan Vance beginning in June of 2023. It outlines in dated entries the specific language Jonathan was instructed to use in his sessions with me and the responses Victoria expected those sessions to produce. Daniel turned to the second page. His jaw tightened slightly. The second section is a financial record. It documents 12 wire transfers from an account held by Charles Edward Miller to an account held by Jonathan Vance between June and November of 2023. The transfers total $120,000. The memo field on each transfer reads, Strategic Consulting Fee. Victoria's hand moved to the folder in front of her. She opened it. She turned to the second section. I watched her eyes move across the numbers, and I watched her calculate not denies, not panic, but calculate, which told me she was still in the mode of a person looking for an angle, still believing there was a version of this she could manage. The third section, I said, is a sworn affidavit signed and notarized on the 14th of March 2024 by Jonathan Vance. I heard Charles pull in a breath. In that affidavit, Mr. Vance states under oath that he held no valid license to practice mental health counseling in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts at any point during his sessions with me, his registration having been revoked in March of 2019. He further states that the purpose of those sessions, as communicated to him by Victoria Miller, was not therapeutic. It was to generate a psychological profile supporting a guardianship petition. Daniel had reached the affidavit. He was reading slowly the way he read things he intended to act on. Victoria set her folder down. She looked at Jonathan across the room. Jonathan, her voice was very quiet and very even. Whatever you think you're doing right now, I want you to think very carefully about Victoria. Daniel Reeves did not raise his voice. He simply said her name in a tone that ended the sentence she had started, the tone of a man who had decided something. I'm going to ask you not to speak to any witness in this room. Please. Victoria closed her mouth. A muscle worked in her jaw. Charles leaned forward with both forearms on the table, his face now the color of old concrete, and looked at me with an expression that mixed fury and desperation in roughly equal parts. Dad, he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. Whatever you think this is going to accomplish, Charles. I met his eyes directly. Let Daniel finish reading. Charles leaned back. His hands were shaking against the table. He pressed them flat to stop it, and that made it more visible, not less. The fourth section, I said, concerns Lily. Lily had been sitting very still in her chair by the window. At the sound of her name, her head came up sharply. I looked at her. Lily, this section documents the $72,500 transfer Charles made to your personal account in November of 2023. It also contains the forensic analysis Owen Barrett conducted on the bank transfer screenshot. Victoria showed you the one showing alleged transfers from my account to offshore holdings. I paused. Those records were fabricated. Owen traced them to a document creation service Victoria accessed from her home IP address in October of 2023. Lily's face went very still. Her lips parted, her hands folded in her lap, gripped each other so tightly the knuckles blanched white. "There is also page 4, I said quietly. "I want you to read it, Lily. I want you to see it yourself." She looked down at the folder. Her fingers moved to page 4 with a careful, reluctant motion of someone turning over a stone they are not certain they want to look under. I did not read it aloud. I had read it 30 times. I knew every word. What it said was not something I needed to announce. It was something Lily needed to find herself in her own time, in her own silence. She read it once. Then she read it again. The color left her face in a single visible wave, starting at her forehead and moving downward. Her chin began to tremble. She pressed her lips together hard, trying to hold it, and for a moment she managed it. Then a sound came out of her that was not quite a word, and not quite a cry, something in between, something broken, and she turned to look at Charles with her eyes full of tears and her whole face shaking. What she had just read was the paragraph in which Victoria had calculated her own sister-in-law as a temporary problem, a liability to be managed until the moment Lily's grief could be converted into a signature on a legal document. After that point in Victoria's precise accounting, Lily finally had value, not as a daughter, not as a person, as a tool that had served its purpose. "You sold me," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, raw, and stripped of everything except the pure shock of it. "You sold me for $72,500. Charles opened his mouth. "Don't!" The word came out of Lily like something she had been holding at pressure for months. Her voice rose and cracked and rose again. "Don't say anything to me right now. Don't you dare say a single word to me right now." Sophie Callahan stood up from her chair and placed the original trust agreement on the table in front of Daniel Reeves without speaking. She opened it to page 7 and set it down so the fraud exclusion clause was visible from across the table. Daniel read it. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them with the cloth he kept in his breast pocket, which I had observed him do twice before in 30 years, when he was giving himself a moment to think through something serious. He put them back on. He picked up his phone. "I'm suspending all proceedings as of this moment," he said to the room. His voice was measured and final, the voice of a man reading from a prepared internal script. "I am required under Massachusetts general laws, Chapter 19A, to report documented evidence of elder financial abuse to the Attorney General's office. I am making that call now. I would ask everyone to remain in the building." He stood up from the table, walked to the far end of the dining room near the window, and made the call. The room held its breath around the sound of his voice, low and precise, delivering facts into a phone, to an office that would now begin a process none of us in that room could stop. The 45 minutes after Daniel made that phone call were the longest I had spent in that house since the morning Eleanor died. Nobody left. Daniel had asked everyone to remain, and everyone did, though, for very different reasons. Daniel stayed because he was a professional, completing a legal obligation. Sophie stayed because I had asked her to. Claire stayed because she had driven 4 hours to be in that room, and she was not going anywhere. Peggy stayed because leaving had apparently not occurred to her as an option. Charles stayed because Claire was standing near the doorway. He had tried to leave 8 minutes after Daniel made the call. He had stood up abruptly, pushed back his chair so hard it scraped against the hardwood, and moved toward the dining room entrance with his jaw set and his eyes forward, the walk of a man who had decided that forward motion was better than staying still. Claire stepped into the doorway. She was 61 years old and 5'4", and she had spent 34 years managing lecture halls full of students who thought they could leave early, and she looked at her nephew with an expression of absolute unhurried authority. "Sit down, Charles," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Charles stopped. Something moved across his face, surprise first, then anger, then something underneath the anger that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who has been running very hard for a very long time and has just been given a reason to stop. He turned around. He went back to his chair. He sat down and put both elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands. Victoria did not try to leave. She sat in her chair with her leather portfolio closed in front of her, and her hands folded on top of it, and stared at the middle distance with the expression of a person who has shifted into a mode of pure calculation. Not panic, not grief, not remorse, just the cold, rapid assessment of someone trying to identify which move was still available to her. There were none. I think she knew that. But the habit of looking for them was too deeply ingrained to stop. Owen Barrett called at the 30-minute mark. I stepped into the hallway to take it. "Ryan is outside," Owen said. "He drove down from Andover this morning. He's been sitting in his car on Com Ave for the last hour. He says he'll come in if you need him." "Tell him to wait," I said. "I'll send someone out if Daniel needs his statement today." I went back into the dining room. Lily had not moved from her chair by the window. She had stopped crying. The tears had run their course and left her face raw and hollowed out her eyes red-rimmed, her hands finally still in her lap after 45 minutes of gripping each other. She was staring at the folder on the table in front of her, not reading it anymore, just staring at it the way you stare at something that has changed the shape of everything you thought you understood. Peggy Hollis stood up from her corner chair. She was not a dramatic woman. She had never in 20 years of being our neighbor made a speech or sought attention or positioned herself at the center of anything. She stood up, and she looked at Charles, and she looked at Victoria, and her blue eyes were very clear and very direct and full of something that was not anger exactly, but was close to it. The particular feeling of a person who has watched something wrong happen over a long period of time and has finally been given the moment to say so. "I watched Eleanor Miller build everything in this house," Peggy said. Her voice was steady and unhurried. "I watched her work for 30 years to make something that would last. She deserved better than what you two did to her family." She turned to include Charles in it deliberately and without hesitation. "Both of you." Then she sat back down. Nobody answered her. There was nothing to say. At the 43-minute mark, 2 officers from the Boston Police Department arrived at the front door. Not to make arrests, the investigation had barely begun, and an arrest requires probable cause established through a process that takes longer than 45 minutes. They were there to take an initial report document the parties present and ensure that Charles and Victoria understood formally and on the record that they were required to remain in Massachusetts and make themselves available for the investigation that Daniel Reeves's call had set in motion. One officer spoke briefly with Daniel. The other stood near the entrance and observed the room with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to be a witness. Charles lifted his face from his hands when the officers came in. His eyes were red. His suit jacket had developed a crease across the shoulder from where he had been hunched over the table. He looked at the officers, and then he looked at me, a long, terrible look, the look of a son who has done something he cannot take back and is only now in this moment fully understanding that. I held his gaze. I did not look away from it, and I did not soften it. He needed to see it clearly, and I needed to give him that, even though every part of me that had ever loved him ached in a way I had not expected and could not have prepared for. Then Lily stood up from her chair by the window. She crossed the room, slowly, her arms wrapped around herself, her red-rimmed eyes fixed on the floor in front of her feet. She stopped in front of me. She stood there for a moment without speaking, and then her knees buckled and she went down onto the floor in front of me in a single graceless movement. Not a theatrical gesture, just the collapse of a person whose legs had finally stopped holding them up. A sound came out of her that I will not try to describe, except to say that it was the sound of someone discovering all at once the full weight of what they had done. I looked down at my daughter for a long time. My chest ached with something that was grief and love and anger, and the particular sorrow of a father who understands that the wound between them is real and will take longer to heal than this afternoon. "I forgive you, Lily," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "But the hurt you caused when you chose to believe them instead of me is real. I need time alone." She nodded against the floor. She did not beg. She did not argue. She just pressed her forehead briefly against her folded hands and then sat back on her heels and looked up at me with her face completely open and completely wrecked. "I know," she said. "I know, Dad." I picked up my briefcase from the table. I looked at Daniel, who gave me a nod that said everything that needed to be said between us. I looked at Sophie, who had her hands pressed flat together in front of her mouth and her eyes bright with tears she was holding back. I looked at Claire, who was watching me from the doorway with an expression of steady, quiet love that had been there my whole life and that I had not always deserved and had not always recognized and was extraordinarily grateful for now. I did not look at Charles again. I did not look at Victoria. I walked out of the dining room through the front hallway, past Eleanor's Frank Lloyd Wright print, and out through the front door into the April afternoon. The air outside smelled like cut grass and car exhaust, and the faint mineral smell of rain coming in off the harbor. I stood on the front steps for a moment with my briefcase in my hand and the late afternoon light on my face. For the first time in 18 months, I breathed without feeling like the ground was moving beneath me. The work was done. The structure had held. The 2 weeks after the anniversary were the quietest of my adult life. Not peaceful exactly. Quiet the way a construction site is quiet after the demolition crew has finished, and before the rebuild begins, a particular absence of noise that is not the same as stillness, because underneath it you can hear the structural settling, the slow adjustment of everything that remains to the new weight distribution of what has been removed. Margaret Cole called on the Monday morning after. Her voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, not exactly warmth, because Margaret was not a warm woman in the conventional sense, but something close to satisfaction, the satisfaction of a professional who has done a difficult job correctly. The Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation Friday evening, she said. They moved quickly, which tells me Daniel's report was thorough. Charles and Victoria have been contacted by investigators. Their attorneys have already been in touch with the AG's office, which means they know exactly how serious this is. She paused. Arthur, they are looking at multiple felony charges, elder financial abuse under Chapter 19, A, larceny by fraud under Chapter 2, 66 Section 30, procurement of fraudulent medical documentation. Each charge carries up to 5 years. And because the $72,500 transfer to Lily went through a federally regulated banking system, the United States Attorney's Office has been notified of potential wire fraud under Title 18, Section 1343. That is a federal charge with a maximum of 20 years. I sat with that for a moment. 20 years was a number that did not feel real when attached to my son's name. What happens to Lily's money? I asked. The trust is fully protected, Margaret said. Daniel has filed a motion with the probate court confirming the fraud exclusion clause is operative. The funds have been transferred to independent management at a fiduciary institution. No one touches them until Lily meets the original conditions Eleanor set out. The trust is exactly what Eleanor designed it to be. I thanked her and hung up. Jonathan Vance had already submitted a full cooperation agreement to the Attorney General's office the week before. His affidavit combined with his cooperation had been enough for prosecutors to treat him as a material witness rather than a primary defendant. He would face a licensing board investigation and almost certainly a civil suit from me, which Margaret had already begun preparing. He would not practice counseling again. But he would not go to prison in all likelihood if he continued to cooperate fully. Ryan Kellerman submitted his written statement to investigators on the Wednesday of that first week. It was 11 pages long, Margaret told me, and documented Charles's financial deterioration in precise dated detail going back to 2021. Ryan had known for 2 years. He had not come forward sooner because Charles was his business partner, and he had told himself it was not his place. He told investigators he had not slept properly since the day he heard about the guardianship petition. He looked, Owen Barrett told me afterward, like a man who had been waiting for someone to give him permission to tell the truth. Sophie Callahan sent me a photograph on the Thursday of the first week. It came in an email with no subject line and no message, just the photograph attached. It was the image she had described to me in the Vermont cabin in February. Eleanor seated at Daniel's conference table in 2021, pen in hand, the trust agreement open in front of her, her face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression of complete settled peace. I printed it and put it in a frame and placed it on the shelf above the wood stove in the Vermont cabin next to the one I already had. Peggy called every Tuesday morning at 8:15. She never stayed on the phone long, 5 minutes at most. She asked how Vermont was, told me one thing that had happened on Marlborough Street that week, and said goodbye. It was exactly the right amount of contact, and I was more grateful for it than I knew how to say. Lily called on the Friday of the second week. She did not apologize again. I think she understood somehow that apologies were not what the moment required, that what the moment required was simply to begin. Her voice was steadier than I expected, with an undertone of exhaustion that I recognized as the particular tiredness of someone who has recently had their entire understanding of a situation restructured from the ground up. "Dad," she said, "I just wanted to ask, do you need anything up there?" "No," I said. "I have everything I need." A pause. The kind of pause that is not empty, but full of things that exist between two people that neither of them yet knows how to say. "Okay," she said. "Good. Thank you for calling Lily." "Yeah?" Her voice caught slightly on the single syllable. "Yeah, of course." After I hung up, I sat at the cabin table for a long time, with my hands flat on the wood and the Vermont afternoon light coming through the east window, at the angle it always came, at this time of year, low and golden and slightly melancholy. The light of a season that is not quite finished arriving. My son sold me for $120,000. He sold his own father to steal the trust fund his mother had built, with 30 years of her life, and her work, and her particular hard-won understanding of how the world operated and how people inside it needed to be protected from one another. He had laid out a plan with his wife and executed it with patience and precision and had very nearly succeeded. But he had forgotten one thing: an old iPad he had left under the cushion of a leather sofa in a house he no longer lived in. That iPad cost him everything. I looked out the window at the Vermont hillside, where the last of the afternoon light was pulling back from the tree line, and the sky above it was going from gold to the particular deep blue that comes just before dark in April, when the days are finally long enough again to feel like they mean something. I thought about Eleanor building those conditions into the trust agreement, not out of cruelty, not out of distrust of me, but out of the clear-eyed practical love of a woman who had grown up with nothing and understood that the world required structure, required protection, required the particular unglamorous work of building things that held. I thought about what she had said to me in Daniel's office on the day she signed it, the thing I had not fully understood until now. The money isn't the inheritance, Arthur. The conditions are. The envelope arrived on a Friday morning in the first week of May. I heard the mail slot in the cabin door click open and shut at just after 9, and I finished my coffee before I went to pick it up, the way Eleanor had always finished whatever she was doing before she checked the mail, because she believed that the habit of letting things interrupt you was a habit that compounded over time into something damaging. I had picked that up from her without noticing the way you pick up most of the things that matter from people you love, not through instruction, but through proximity. The envelope was standard white business-sized. My name was written on the front in handwriting I recognized before I had consciously registered whose it was. The round, careful letters Lily had been forming since middle school, the handwriting of a girl who had pressed too hard with her pencil as a child, because she wanted everything she wrote to be permanent. There was no return address. I carried it to the table and sat down before I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. No preamble, no lengthy apology. Just Lily's handwriting in the same round, careful letters, as the envelope a paragraph long. Dad, I was going through the last of Mom's office boxes last week, the ones from her real estate firm that nobody had opened since she got sick. In the bottom of the third box, under some contracts and a set of property keys I don't recognize, I found a flat wooden frame wrapped in brown paper. I unwrapped it. It was a pencil drawing a floor plan. I think, though, I'm not an architect, so I'm not completely sure. On the back in Mom's handwriting it says, "Our first house, Arthur's drawing, 1987. She had it framed, Dad. She kept it all those years. I thought you should have it back. I hope Vermont is treating you well." Below that, she had written just her name. Not Love Lily, not I'm sorry Lily. Just Lily, her name alone, which somehow contained more than either of those other things would have. Wrapped inside the folded letter was the drawing. I had not seen it since Victoria had moved it from the study bookshelf sometime in the fall of 2023, during one of those calculated disruptions designed to make me doubt my own memory. I had spent 3 days searching for it, with my hands shaking and my chest tight, and Jonathan Vance's carefully planted questions circling in my head like water going down a drain. I had found it eventually in that cardboard box in the garage, and I had told myself I was relieved. But the relief had been complicated by the lingering question of whether I had put it there myself, and simply could not remember. Now, holding it in my hands at the cabin table, in the early May light, I understood for the first time, with complete certainty, that I had never put it in that box. Victoria had moved it, and then, at some point, she had moved it back, or Charles had, or someone had done it to clean up a thread they were afraid might unravel something. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that it was here now, in my hands slightly worn at the edges, the pencil lines faded but still legible. I had drawn it in the winter of 1987, on a Sunday afternoon, when the snow had closed everything down and Eleanor had said simply, "Tell me what our house looks like." So I drew it for her on the spot, rough done in pencil, with proportions that would have made my professors wince. A front porch, a study with south-facing windows, a kitchen that opened into a dining room, a garden along the south wall. We never built that house. We bought the one on Marlborough Street instead, and Eleanor had stood in the kitchen the first day we walked through it and said, "This is it." She had kept the drawing for 37 years. She had framed it and carried it through 3 offices tucked into the bottom of a box where it would survive anything. I sat at the cabin table and looked at those pencil lines for a long time at my own handwriting at 27 years old, in the corner of the page where I had written the date and Eleanor's name and a small arrow pointing to the garden wall with the words, "For the lilies." For the lilies. I had written that in the winter of 1987, before we had a house, before we had children, before any of the things that would constitute our life together had existed except as possibility. I had drawn a garden wall and written "For the lilies" because Eleanor had mentioned once that she wanted white lilies along a south-facing wall someday, and I had included it in the drawing because it was hers to ask for and mine to provide. And that was what I understood a marriage to be at 27, standing at the beginning of something I could not yet fully see. I pushed back from the table, put on my coat, and went outside. The Vermont morning was clear and cold in the particular way of early May in the Northeast, when the warmth has arrived in principle but not yet in practice. Bright sun, hard shadows. The air carrying the smell of thawed earth and new grass and the faint sweetness of something blooming just beyond the tree line. The garden at the south side of the cabin was Eleanor's doing. She had planted it the second summer, after we bought the cabin, working from a sketch she had made on the back of a grocery receipt, laying out the beds with a methodical care that I had recognized immediately as the same approach she brought to every property she had ever acquired. The white lilies were there. They came back every year without being asked the way the best things do not, because anyone tended them particularly, but because Eleanor had put them in the right place to begin with, and they had taken hold and decided to stay. They were not yet fully open, being early May, and the season not quite ready for them, but the buds were there closed and upright and very white against the dark earth, with the particular posture of something that knows exactly what it is and is taking its time. I cut 6 stems with the pruning shears Eleanor had kept hanging on the nail inside the garden shed door. I carried them inside and found the old blue ceramic pitcher she had bought at a pottery fair in Woodstock. The 3rd summer we came here, the one she had described as the exact color of a good sky, and I filled it with water at the kitchen sink and put the lilies in it and carried it to the table. I went back to the shelf above the wood stove and took down both photographs, the one I had always had and the one Sophie Callahan had sent me of Eleanor signing the trust agreement with her face turned toward the camera in that expression of complete settled peace. I placed them side by side on the table next to the pitcher of lilies. Then I unfolded the drawing from 1987 and laid it flat on the table in front of me, smoothing the creases with the flat of my hand, the way Eleanor had always smoothed things, documents, tablecloths, the hair of our children when they were small, with a steadiness and care that said, "This matters, and I am paying attention to it." I sat down. Outside, the May morning was doing what May mornings do in Vermont, filling up with light and bird song and the particular unhurried energy of a world that has come back from winter and is not in a hurry to explain itself or justify the time it took. I thought about Eleanor at 25, sitting in an Alston apartment, watching me draw a house we did not yet own on a Sunday when the snow had closed everything down. I thought about Eleanor at 58, sitting at Daniel Reeves's conference table and signing a document she had designed with the care of an architect, because that was what she was in her own way. An architect of structures that protected the people she loved from the things she could see coming that they could not. I thought about Lily's handwriting on an envelope with no return address. I thought about the way her voice had caught on a Friday phone call that had lasted 4 minutes and changed nothing and changed everything. I thought about Charles, and I let myself feel the grief of that, without trying to resolve it into something cleaner. He was my son. He had done what he had done. Both of those things were true at the same time, and they would remain true at the same time for whatever years I had left. And the work of living with that was not finished, and would not be finished soon. Eleanor had once told me in the cabin on a September evening, when the maples outside were going gold, and we had been talking about a family we knew whose children had stopped speaking to them, that the strongest structures were not the ones that never bent. They were the ones that bent and still held. She had said it the way she said most things that mattered without announcement in the middle of a conversation about something else, as though the insight were simply the next logical step in a thought she had been having for a while. I had not understood it fully then. At 64 years old, sitting in a cabin in Vermont with white lilies and Eleanor's blue pitcher and her drawing from 1987 open on the table in front of me, and both photographs of her side by side in the May light, I understood it completely. I had bent further than I believed possible. There had been months when I genuinely wondered if I would come back from it, but I had held. Not because of my own strength, because of Eleanor's conditions, because of Peggy's refusal, because Claire drove north in the dark, because Sophie kept a document for 3 years, because Jonathan chose in the end the last piece of dignity he had left, because Lily found a drawing in the bottom of a box and sent it back to me without explanation, which was explanation enough. The most valuable thing Eleanor left behind was never in that trust fund. It was the promise I kept. I picked up the drawing and carried it to the shelf above the wood stove, where I propped it against the wall between the 2 photographs of Eleanor. Then I stepped back and looked at all 3 of them together. The drawing from the beginning, the photograph from the middle, the photograph from near the end, and felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Outside, the Vermont morning went on doing what it was doing, which was simply being itself unhurried and sufficient the way the best things are. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. This has been my family story, not the version I ever wanted to live, but the one I was given. Family betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern and a doctor's referral, in a wire transfer marked as a gift. It moves quietly through the rooms of your life for months before you understand what you've been breathing in. My advice to you is simple. Don't do what I did. Don't wait for a court letter to trust your instincts. Don't let the people who claim to love you rewrite who you are one careful word at a time without questioning the script. The moment something in your home feels engineered rather than felt, pay attention to that feeling. It is trying to tell you something true. I am not a bitter man. I believe God places exactly the right things in exactly the right places at exactly the right time, including an old iPad under a sofa cushion in January. Every family story carries a lesson. Mine taught me that the strongest thing a person can do is not fight loudly. It is to hold on quietly until the truth finds its moment. If this family story reached something in you, if you have ever felt quietly erased by the people who were supposed to protect you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I know it was a long road. A final note. Some of the stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for the purpose of meaningful storytelling. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings, find what speaks to you. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.